All right, the first step after you have your artist research done is to now choose one of your artists to inspire your sneaker design. Now, not copy, but inspire. You can also choose multiple artists. So I've chose the artist David Hockney, and what I'm gonna take is I'm gonna try to match some of his really bright colors and some of his textures as part of my sneaker design. So I've created a couple sketches from the side, from the top, and from the back. I am requiring you to sketch first, and you can use colored pencils to figure out where you're going to put different textures and colors. It's important to do this in multiple views on your sneaker because this is a three-dimensional object. You might also want to figure out where you put things like laces and the holes for the laces and where you're going to break up your design. Think about if you're going to have the toe of your shoe be separate. Think about how you're going to have the bottom of your shoe, the sole of your shoe drawn on so we can make this more realistic. So I'm going to first take my pencil and I'm going to start drawing out just with pencil where the sole of my shoe is. You might look at like a favorite sneaker design of yours to figure out how you're going to break up this kind of basic shape into a more realistic shoe shape.
So I'm drawing on a sole all the way around. I would also recommend looking at an actual sneaker to do this. I'm going to draw the toe of my sneaker that wraps around. This is kind of like how it's built, the structure, some of those details that are going to make it look like a real shoe. I'm going to figure out the shape of the tongue up here and how it goes down to touch the sole of the shoe, or sorry, the toe of the shoe. And then how the sides of my shoe are going to wrap around the rivets that the laces go in. You don't have to include laces, but you can. I'm going to show you a really simple way to do that. If there's some kind of logo on the tongue of the shoe. And then I'm going to split up the back into this kind of the spine of the shoe in the back. And then I'm going to split up, instead of just having one big section here, a lot of shoes have like a decorative band to break up the design. So I'm going to do that on both sides. You might have a shoe design that you really like that you want to follow. But the colors and the textures are going to be based off of your artist. So a little advice about the rivets and the laces. I would just have vertical lines, or you can crisscross them too, just to give the illusion that there are laces coming out of the rivets. And you can paint that detail on. So you might take out a shoe and try to figure out how to make kind of the illusion that there's laces on your shoe. But I wouldn't make it super, super detailed.
Okay, so in order to get set up for paint, I've opened up my primary colors. I have my palette, my shoe, my sketch. I also have my artist, image out, water, and you should have a round and a square brush in your kit if you requested brushes. So I don't want to see these pure colors that I gave you on your shoe, but because I want you to practice color matching. So if I really look at the colors that I'm choosing, I would have to change and mix these colors. So I'm going to start with this kind of bright pink. And I also want you to think about, I want you to paint in 2 layers. The first layer is just getting a solid color down, and the second layer is where we're adding the details. So I'm just going to focus on trying to match some of the colors that I want to use. So as you can see in my sketch, I've used the bright pink in my toe and on the back spine, and also in the circles for my laces. So I'm going to mix that pink as best as I can, trying to make sure that I don't muddy up my colors by washing my brush in between. And my advice for painting on plaster is to water down the paint a little bit. So once I have the color that I need, David Hockney was all about really, really bright, vibrant colors. I'm gonna just take my brush and add water into it, almost to make like a watercolor. You wanna do this because the plaster has lots of texture, and this will get the paint to go on easier on a really textured surface. So hold your brush down here so you have control, not up here. I'm starting with a square brush because it has that flat edge. And I want to start by using that flat edge right up against the edge of where that pink is going to go. You'll find that painting a sculpture is a lot different than painting something that's two-dimensional. You'll have to kind of hold it in your non-dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, so I'm holding it in my left hand. And I can't paint it quickly because I get that kind of dried look. So you're gonna kind of have to stipple the paint color into all of those cracks and creases, and it'll look a lot smoother once it's all the same color. So you're trying to get rid of that texture. I would recommend using the edge and going really slowly around the outline of the shape and then going in and filling in the inside of the shape. Doing this quickly is not going to get you the result that you want, so take your time. And remember, I'm going to put a texture on top of this, so this is just my first layer of trying to get the white covered. So I'm going to go ahead and make a lot of different colors and speed through this process so you can see what a first layer looks like when it's finished. Okay, so my first layer is just getting blocks of color down. A couple things about that. If you watch closely, you'll notice I made a mistake and put blue up here when I really wanted green. So make sure you slow down a little bit when you're working. But I was able to repaint over it. So you can repaint over a color if you make a mistake or you're not happy with it. You can also paint on top of your pencil lines, and if you're using a lighter color, they'll show through. Sometimes that's easier than going around all the little spaces. And the last thing to think about is whether you're going to paint the inside or not. If you didn't plaster the whole inside, the paint's probably not going to work very well on the cup. So I'm just deciding to have a clean edge around my color so that my inside is just white, and I'm not painting the bottom of my shoe either. You'll notice that the paint dries really quickly. And my second layer is going to be all of the details. I have some texture in the background here, some leaf details from my artist, some pattern details inspired by my artist, and the laces. So I'm going to let this dry until it doesn't feel cold anymore. It feels cold because the plaster has absorbed a lot of the paint. So I'm going to let it dry for a little bit before I start my details. Okay, so for my details, I'm going to use my rounded brush. If you don't have one, you don't really need to use one. Just keep your details bigger. But my rounded brush is going to get me a nice line. And I'm going to choose contrasting colors. My artist had the same colors, but a darker value or a lighter value on top. So I'm going to make sure that I can see my contrasting colors on my shoe. So if you're drawing lines, I would highly recommend watering down the color that you're going to use quite a bit so that it becomes almost like ink, and then rolling your brush and taking off a lot of the extra paint and holding your brush way down here so you have lots of control over it. I also like to rest my hand on the table when I draw lines or when I paint lines, and rest the shoe on the table as I paint lines.
Go easy on yourself if they're not perfect, because this is a really rough surface to paint on. This should look like a handmade object because it is. So no, it's not going to look like a real shoe. Think of this as like if you were getting paid to design a shoe, this would be your prototype. I'm going to show you a couple other techniques. I'm going to stop this one, but you can see how I'm rotating the shoe as I change the direction of my line, and I'm constantly going back in and getting more paint on my brush as my brush gets dry. So that's doing line designs.
Another technique that I'd like to show you is double dipping. So this background here has kind of a blue, green, and a yellow. So I first started with a solid shade of green, and now I'm going to use my square brush, and I'm going to double dip into blue and green and yellow and have all of those colors on my brush. and I want my brush strokes to show.
So I'm using what's called a dry brush, and I'm adding kind of that atmospheric texture to the background of my shoe there. So sometimes showing brush strokes is part of the technique. Sometimes hiding them is more important. So you kind of have to look at your artist. How do they use their brush strokes if you have a painter? And if you don't have a painter, that's kind of up to you. Whether you want your brush strokes to show, to add texture, or whether you want to hide them and make them solid. And then the very last thing that I'm going to show you on adding details is the laces in the smaller sections. You want to use the very tip of a rounded brush. I might even decide to draw them back in if I lost them, but I'm just going to go ahead and freehand them. I'm going to put my hand way down here close to the hair of my brush so I can just use the very tip of it to add back in all the little details that I had covered up from before. So the second layer is going to take more time. The first layer is all about getting rid of all the white, and the second layer is about adding your details. You may need to go over a section completely, change the color of it if it didn't work. When you're painting a sculpture, you want to think about all sides of it. So I'm constantly rotating it and looking at it from all sides, seeing what works. The most important thing is to have fun, though, because I want you to create something you're really proud of. I'm going to go ahead and speed through finishing up my details.
Okay, so in doing this, you can see that my palette has lots of different colors on it. It should be enough room to do this project. I made quite a few mistakes, but I know that with paint, you can always repaint or slow down. A little bit of design advice, your sketch may differ from what your final one looks like. So I decided to change a couple things as I worked because either I couldn't get the right color or I didn't like how it looked on the shoe. And I was really unhappy with this section at first, but then I decided to add a color from somewhere else on top and add more detail. So I think outlining looks really nice, and I outlined the top with red. Design-wise, it works because I have this red popping up in a couple different places on my shoe. So as you go, you'll definitely need to change your design to make it work for you based off of what colors you can mix. And I said not to use the primary colors, but obviously if you need a solid red, you need a solid red. So there's not much mixing that you'll need to do. So take your time. The second layer should be all of your little details. And every once in a while, set your shoe down and step back from it. Because when we look at something too closely for too long, we see all the flaws, but when we step back, we can see it bigger picture. And this is my final shoe inspired by the artist, David Hockney.